I only wanted coffee, until the woman behind the counter became the reason I kept coming back. Mornings have always been my favorite part of the day, though not for the reasons most people would expect. It isn't the sunrise that draws me out of bed, or the promise of productivity. For me, it's the quiet anticipation of stepping into the small cafe on the corner of Willow Street, the place where routine feels like comfort, and comfort has taken on the shape of a woman who works behind the counter. The cafe itself is nothing special. The windows fog up on cooler mornings, the wooden tables are nicked from years of elbows and coffee rings, and the air carries the constant undertone of roasted beans and steamed milk. But to me, it feels like the heart of the neighborhood, and she is the one who gives it that heartbeat. She is there every morning without fail, dressed in the same charcoal gray apron, sleeves rolled up neatly to her elbows. Her movements are steady, unhurried, like she has learned the rhythm of the espresso machine and made it her own. The hiss of steam punctuates her presence, the clink of cups seems to follow her gestures. There is a grace in how she pours, wipes, turns, and greets each customer, efficient, but never cold. When my turn comes, her eyes flicker toward me with that same small smile, the one that doesn't stretch too far but warms everything around it. I tell myself it's just courtesy, the kind she gives to everyone. And yet I've caught the difference, a subtle pause, the faintest softening in her expression, as if she knows me better than the menu board above her head. Her voice carries a calm cadence, low and measured, and I always find myself leaning in a little closer than I need to just to hear her. There's something about the way she asks, "Your usual?" as if it's a question and a reassurance at the same time. She remembers, of course. She always does. I nod, and she gets to work. I watch without meaning to, my eyes following the way she tucks a loose strand of hair behind her ear, how the light catches in the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, signs of years that only add to her beauty. She is not the careless energy of youth, but the quiet magnetism of a woman who knows who she is. When she places the cup in front of me, her fingers brush mine for the briefest moment. Perhaps by accident. Perhaps not. The ceramic is warm, but not as warm as the pulse that shoots through me at the contact. I offer a quiet thank you, and she tilts her head, as if she knows there's more I'd like to say but haven't found the courage. I retreat to my usual seat by the window, where I pretend to read. In truth, I'm watching her reflection in the glass, moving gracefully from one task to the next, unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, of the effect she has on me. It has become my ritual, the coffee, the corner seat, the quiet presence of a woman who makes the ordinary feel extraordinary. And though I've never admitted it aloud, I know the truth. I don't come here for the coffee. I come here for her. By the second week of my unbroken ritual, I'd begun to suspect she noticed more than I gave her credit for. It was in the way her gaze lingered for just a moment longer, or how she seemed to anticipate my order before I even opened my mouth. Still, I hadn't expected her to call me out the way she did that morning. The cafe was its usual symphony, the hum of low conversation, the metallic clatter of spoons against ceramic, the soft jazz spilling from the speakers overhead. I stepped up to the counter, rehearsing my smile in the same way one might rehearse a line in a play. But before I could say a word, she looked at me with that half-smile of hers, not mocking, not quite teasing, but undeniably knowing. "You come here too often," she said, tilting her head ever so slightly, her eyes narrowing in mock suspicion. Her words caught me off guard. For a heartbeat I froze, staring at her as though I'd been caught doing something illicit. And maybe, in a way, I had. Coming here day after day wasn't just about caffeine anymore, it was about her. I could have laughed it off, made some light excuse about habit or convenience. But instead, the truth slipped out before I could second-guess myself. "Only for you." The words felt too bold the moment they left my mouth. I almost wished I could pull them back, soften them, make them sound like a joke. But they hung there between us, clear and impossible to disguise. Her eyebrows lifted, just enough to show her surprise. Then, as if deciding she wouldn't let me see too much, she composed herself. A faint flush rose in her cheeks, so subtle it might have been the glow from the espresso machine behind her. She pressed her lips together, fighting a smile, and shook her head. "That's dangerous talk for a cup of coffee," she said lightly, but her voice had changed. Quieter. Warmer. She turned to prepare my drink, but something about her rhythm was different, less practiced, more human. The usual effortless motion seemed slightly slowed, as though she was aware of my eyes on her. I watched the way her hands moved, the care she put into each small gesture, and I wondered if she knew how much I noticed. When she returned, she set the cup down gently, her fingers brushing mine in the handoff. Normally it might have felt accidental, but this time it lingered, if only for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Long enough for my breath to hitch. Long enough for her eyes to flicker up to mine and then dart away. I took the cup, feeling its warmth seep into my palms, though the heat rising in my chest had little to do with the coffee itself. I managed a quiet "thank you," though my voice felt unsteady. She gave a small nod, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips, and moved on to the next customer. But something had shifted between us. The air felt different, charged in a way I hadn't experienced before. I carried my drink to my usual seat by the window, but I didn't pretend to read this time. My eyes betrayed me, following her across the cafe, catching the way she occasionally glanced my way before quickly looking elsewhere. It was nothing, a playful comment, an impulsive reply, a brush of fingers. Yet it felt like the start of something neither of us could ignore. And for the first time, I wondered if she was just as curious about me as I was about her. The storm arrived without warning, sweeping across the city in sheets of rain that blurred everything into silver-gray streaks. By late afternoon, the cafe was nearly deserted. Most people had rushed home before the clouds broke open, but I stayed, tucked into my usual corner seat, watching drops race each other down the fogged-up window. She was there, of course, steady as always, moving behind the counter with practiced grace. Yet without the usual crowd, her pace slowed. The cafe felt different in the quiet. No chatter, no constant hum of footsteps. Just the lone murmur of rain against the glass and the occasional hiss from the espresso machine. I watched her lean against the counter, one hand absent-mindedly tracing the rim of a cup. For once, she didn't wear the shield of a busy barista. She seemed almost still. I got up, more out of instinct than plan, and walked over. She glanced up, surprised to see me standing there when I could have easily stayed tucked away. "Slow day," I said, offering a small smile. "Slow storm," she replied, exhaling softly. Her eyes drifted to the window, as if she could measure the weight of the rain by sight alone. Then, almost reluctantly, she added, "Days like this remind me how much time I spend here." Her voice carried something unguarded, a trace of weariness. I leaned an elbow on the counter, careful not to make her feel exposed, but curious enough to listen. "You don't like the quiet?" I asked. She gave a quiet laugh, though it held no amusement. "I don't mind the quiet. I mind what comes after. When the lights are off, and I go home to silence. It's easier to keep busy than to notice how empty things can feel." Her confession landed softly but deeply, like a pebble dropped into still water. I felt it ripple through me, tugging at something protective I hadn't realized I carried. I wanted to say something comforting, something wise. But the truth was simpler. I just wanted to be near her in that moment, to show her she wasn't as alone as she thought. "You don't have to close up alone tonight," I said before I could stop myself. "I can stay. Just until the rain lets up." Her eyes met mine then, searching, uncertain, but not dismissive. For a long moment we just stood there, the silence between us threaded with the sound of the storm outside. Thunder rolled, shaking the window panes. She startled slightly, tucking a damp strand of hair behind her ear, her laugh betraying a flicker of nervousness. It was such a small, human gesture, yet it made her seem more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. And in that vulnerability, she was even more beautiful. "Maybe I'll take you up on that," she murmured finally, her lips curving into the faintest smile. So I stayed. The hours slipped by quietly, the rain outside, the dim light inside, and the unspoken truth that neither of us was in a hurry for the storm to end. That night, It wasn't just about coffee anymore. It was about the way she let me glimpse a piece of herself she usually kept hidden. And I knew, without question, I would never forget the sound of her voice confessing that silence was harder to bear than loneliness itself. Closing time arrived slower than usual, as if the storm itself wanted to hold us in place. She moved through the familiar steps of shutting down the cafe, wiping counters, stacking cups, flipping switches, but tonight, it all felt different. Without the usual clatter of customers, every small sound carried weight: the squeak of the mop, the rattle of the key ring, the soft hum she made under her breath without realizing it. I stayed, as promised, keeping her company. Not doing much, really, just sitting nearby, watching, offering the occasional comment that drew out her smile. It was enough. Being in her quiet orbit felt like something rare, something worth protecting. When the last light clicked off, the storm outside had gentled into a steady drizzle. She stood at the door, her coat draped over one arm, and hesitated. "You should head home before it picks up again," she said. I stepped beside her, holding up the umbrella I'd brought. "I'll walk you. No sense in both of us getting soaked." For a moment, she looked as though she might refuse. Independence seemed woven into her, the kind of strength that didn't easily accept help. But then her gaze softened, and with the faintest nod, she let me open the door. The night air was cool, damp with the scent of rain-soaked pavement. I held the umbrella above us, and she stepped closer, her shoulder brushing mine as we found our pace. The sound of raindrops on fabric became our rhythm, steady and intimate. For a long stretch, we didn't speak. But the silence wasn't awkward. It was gentle, familiar. I could feel the warmth radiating from her through the small distance between us, and every so often, when her hand accidentally grazed mine, my chest tightened. She glanced up at me once, quickly, then looked away with a soft laugh. "You don't have to do this, you know." "I know," I said. "But I want to." That answer seemed to surprise her. Her steps slowed slightly, as if she were considering it. Then she smiled faintly, her lips curving with something that wasn't just amusement, something quieter, almost grateful. The streets were nearly empty, puddles reflecting the glow of street lamps. The world felt smaller under the umbrella, like it belonged only to us. I stole glances at her profile, the way the light traced the curve of her cheek, the strands of damp hair escaping her coat collar. She looked at ease, and I realized I hadn't seen her this unguarded before. At her doorway we paused. The rain still whispered around us, but here, under the shelter of the umbrella, it felt hushed. "Thank you," she said softly, her hand coming to rest on my arm. It was a light touch, but it lingered, warm even through the fabric of my sleeve. I wanted to say something, anything that might explain the way my heart was pounding, but the words stuck. Instead, I just held her gaze. Her eyes lingered on mine for a heartbeat too long, then she drew back, retreating into her doorway with a small, private smile. I stood there a moment longer, umbrella still open, watching her disappear inside. The rain hadn't stopped. But somehow, I didn't mind walking home alone. Not when I carried the memory of her hand on my arm, the warmth of her presence beside me, and the quiet promise that something had shifted between us. A few days passed before I saw her again outside the usual routine. The rain had gone, leaving the city washed clean, and the cafe was buzzing with its normal morning rush. She greeted me with her usual small smile, sliding my cup across the counter, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of thought she seemed to tuck away as quickly as it came. I didn't ask. I just carried my coffee to the window and let myself watch her reflection, the same way I always did. It wasn't until later that evening, when the cafe was nearly empty and she was wiping down the tables, that she surprised me. "You know," she said, glancing over her shoulder, "I've got this experiment. A recipe I've been working on. Nothing official. But," she hesitated, biting her lip before continuing, "you want to try it? After I close?" Her tone was casual, but the invitation wasn't. It was a door opening. I nodded before my nerves could interfere. "I'd like that." When the last customer left and the sign on the door flipped to closed, the cafe transformed. Without the noise of strangers, it felt softer, warmer. Lamps glowed in the corners instead of the bright overheads, casting golden pools of light across the wooden tables. The faint scent of roasted beans lingered, mixed with the sweetness of cinnamon and vanilla. She moved differently now, no longer the brisk, efficient barista serving a line of orders. She was slower, more deliberate, her apron loosened, her hair falling more freely around her face. Watching her felt almost intrusive, like glimpsing a part of her she usually kept hidden from the world. "What's the recipe?" I asked as she set out 2 mugs. "Something between coffee and dessert," she said with a soft laugh. "Sweet, but not too sweet. Like life should be, I suppose." She poured carefully, sliding 1 mug toward me. Our fingers touched as I took it, and this time, she didn't move away. We sat across from each other, the cafe utterly quiet except for the rain gutters dripping outside. She told me about her love for trying new blends, how she once dreamed of opening a shop of her own but life had taken her down a different path. I listened, drawn not just to her words but to the way she leaned forward when she spoke, how her eyes lit up when she admitted her passions, her disappointments. At one point, she pulled out a small notebook, the edges worn from use. "These are my ideas," she said, flipping through pages filled with messy handwriting and sketches. She leaned in close to show me, her shoulder brushing mine, her hair grazing my cheek as she pointed. I didn't move away. Neither did she. The air thickened in that moment. The distance between us felt almost unbearable, charged with something we both felt but neither dared name. When I finally looked up, her eyes were already on me. For a breath, it seemed she might lean closer, closing that fragile space. Instead, she drew back, clearing her throat with a quiet laugh. "Anyway," she said softly, "what do you think of the recipe?" I took a slow sip, letting the warmth fill me. "I think," I said, meeting her gaze, "it's perfect. Just like this." Her lips curved, not into a laugh this time, but into something gentler. Something she didn't hide. And for the first time, it felt like she wasn't just letting me into her cafe. She was letting me into her life. The evening lingered, stretching longer than either of us intended. The cafe, dimly lit and empty, felt like it belonged to us alone. The half-finished mugs sat forgotten between us, the steam long faded. What filled the air now wasn't the smell of coffee or the faint buzz of lights overhead. It was something heavier, quieter, and infinitely more fragile. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her cup, as though stalling for words she couldn't quite form. I studied the way her hand moved, graceful and absent-minded, and before I realized it, my own hand had shifted across the table. I let my fingers brush lightly against hers. At first, it was just a touch, soft, uncertain, easily dismissed if she chose to pull away. But she didn't. Instead, after a heartbeat of stillness, she turned her palm upward, allowing my fingers to slip into place with hers. The simplicity of that gesture unraveled me. Her hand was warm, steady, yet trembling faintly, as though she was fighting the same pull I felt, the same risk in allowing closeness where none was supposed to exist. We stayed like that, hands joined across the table, the silence carrying all the words either of us dared say. When I finally looked up, her eyes were on mine. They were softer than I'd ever seen them, stripped of the guarded playfulness she usually wore. Vulnerable. Searching. Testing me. I swallowed, my voice lower than I meant when I whispered her name. It came out like a prayer, reverent and trembling. She drew in a sharp breath, her lips parting slightly, as if she might answer. For the briefest instant, I thought she might lean forward, that the distance between us would finally collapse. The thought alone made my pulse pound so loudly I could feel it in my throat. But then she froze. The softness in her gaze fractured into hesitation. She shook her head gently, her thumb brushing against my hand as though apologizing even as she pulled back just slightly. "This is dangerous," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words landed heavy, but they weren't rejection. They were fear, the kind that comes from knowing the cost of wanting something you shouldn't. I tightened my hold on her hand, just enough to let her know I wasn't letting go. So is pretending, I said quietly. Her breath caught. For a moment, the cafe felt suspended in time, the air thick with tension, the kind that made every second ache with possibility. She looked at me as though torn between gravity and surrender. Her eyes shimmered with something raw, something she couldn't disguise, even as she pulled her hand away at last, retreating into herself with a shaky exhale. The distance between us returned, but it wasn't the same. We had crossed a line, even if we hadn't stepped fully over it. And in the silence that followed, I knew the truth neither of us could speak aloud. We were standing on the edge of something undeniable. And though she feared the fall, I had already leapt. The next morning, I told myself I wouldn't go. I rehearsed the excuses in my head, that I needed a break, that I had work to finish, that it would be better for both of us if I gave her space. But by mid-morning, I was already pushing open the cafe door. The familiar bell above the entrance chimed, and the warmth of roasted beans wrapped around me instantly. Customers filled the space as usual, but it all blurred until my eyes found her behind the counter. She was moving quickly, serving drinks, offering small smiles, but when her gaze landed on me, something in her paused. For a heartbeat, she just looked. No mask, no teasing remark. Just a quiet acknowledgement that I was there. That I had come back. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the counter. She already had a cup in hand, though she lingered instead of rushing to fill it. "You're back," she said softly. Not accusing. Not teasing. Just relieved. "I told you," I murmured with a faint smile. "I come here only for you." Her lips curved, the kind of smile that wasn't for show. She reached for the espresso machine, her hand steady, but I noticed the faintest tremor in her breath. When she finally placed the cup in front of me, her fingers didn't withdraw right away. Instead, they lingered on the rim, brushing against mine deliberately this time. The contact was small, but it was different. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't uncertain. It was a choice. Something in my chest loosened, a knot I hadn't realized I'd been carrying since the night we sat across that table, our hands joined in a dangerous silence. I glanced at the line of customers forming behind me, but she didn't seem to care. With a sudden, quiet resolve, she slipped around the counter, wiping her hands on her apron before tugging it loose. "I'll be right back," she told her coworker. Then she turned to me. "Come with me." She led me to a small corner table, away from the rush, where the light from the windows softened everything. Sitting down across from me, she folded her hands, exhaling slowly as though trying to find the right words. "I don't know where this is going," she admitted. "And I don't want to pretend it's simple. But I also don't want to keep pretending I don't feel something when you're here." Her honesty landed heavier than any declaration could have. My heart raced, not with triumph, but with the quiet relief of knowing we were no longer pretending. I reached across the table again, gently laying my hand over hers. She didn't pull away. In fact, she turned her palm upward, letting our fingers weave together like they had before, but this time, with no hesitation. Customers bustled, cups clinked, the espresso machine hissed, yet none of it mattered. For us, the world had shrunk to the space between our joined hands and the unspoken promise in her eyes. I smiled softly, leaning in just enough for her to hear me over the cafe's noise. "Still think I come here too often?" She laughed, a quiet, unguarded laugh, and her other hand came to rest lightly on my chest, steadying herself as though the moment was too real to stand without grounding. "No," she whispered. "Now I think not often enough. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to." The tenderness in her touch, the steadiness in her gaze, was more intimate than anything else could have been. And in that small cafe, with coffee cooling between us and her hand warm in mine, I realized this was only the beginning, careful, brave, and entirely ours. 12.